In Rome too, Colchis has a reputation of being both an extremely difficult faction as well as a rather mediocre one, with a motley mix of Eastern, Greek, and Caucasian troops that mesh together quite poorly, and frankly compose of the weakest attributes of all three of these cultures. In Divide et Impera, the difficulty of his campaign remains stable, although the troops that Colchis have are somewhat more elite and much more useful than in the base game. But ultimately, Colchis is still a rather weak faction, and one that lacks a certain appeal because you can get better variations of all three of these cultures with the factions that surround Colchis, such as the Bosphorian Kingdom, the Armenians, and Kartli, all of which do their particular cultural units far better than Colchis, which tries to create an odd hybrid of them. Yet, if you are a player who's looking for a very unique campaign as well as a very challenging campaign, Colchis may be for you. So let's get right into this guide and examine Colchis' start position. Alrighty guys, so this is the start position that Colchis is endowed with, and to be completely honest with you, it's an incredibly hard one. Colchis is a type of campaign that you're probably going to have to start and restart at least 3 or 4 times till you can get a playthrough that works for you. Because one small misstep, one small tiny miscalculation can result in your one puny settlement getting destroyed. And speaking of that, you start out with just one settlement, it's Fascis, and it sucks. Only 15,000 people live here, making this an incredibly underpopulated settlement. I mean, the vast majority of settlements in this game start with maybe 25,000 people. The more populous ones in, say, Greece or Macedonia or Thrace or Latium, you know, the more like desirable regions in the game, start out with maybe 30,000 something people. That's kind of the best. But this is incredibly, incredibly remote with only 15,000 people. Now you do have a reasonable 1,500 middle class people to play with at the beginning, so you can recruit some okayish troops, but many factions start out with like double this many middle class people and double the nobility as well, making this actually one of the weaker starts in terms of the settlement that you get. Now, the other thing that really sucks about this campaign is that you're not Greek, as you'd probably imagine with what is a Greek colony. You're actually classified as Caucasian, which is one of the rarest culture groups in the game. I mean, almost nobody shares it. Like, Kartli shares it, your neighbor, who you also have a non-aggression pact with, and then the faction down here, Gabala, they also share it. And then that's it. Only these 3 factions, each of which only possesses one settlement in the game, has the Caucasian culture. And that's a massive problem because almost everybody in the game is going to have cultural aversion to you, and it's just generally going to be hard to make allies, and people are just going to be more prone to declare war on you because of this cultural problem. And it really is a problem to be part of such a minority culture in Rome too. So it's going to be really hard. And here's the other thing, right? Kartli, the owners of the main, most populous, most powerful settlement in your province, you have a non-aggression pact with them. And while it is kind of good that you at least have somebody that's on your side, it does kind of disqualify you from expanding in your own province, which, I mean, that's kind of a problem. Like, how many factions can you basically not expand to the capital if the capital is right within earshot of you? I mean, it's just like this massive stop sign. And if you attack these guys, believe me, every single faction in the general vicinity will immediately declare war on you, and you'll just get wrecked. Like, you cannot attack Mitseka. So you have to figure out how you're going to expand without attacking Mitseka. That's, again, another challenging component of this campaign. Now, what you can do is expand against Trapezos, because you do start out a war with them. And I did realize in my playthroughs that you do have to get rid of Trapezos. Like, it's inevitable. You need to. And the reason why is because they actually recruit a very strong early game military. They actually have the exact same unit roster as Pontus. So these guys are going to spam like nearly 20 hoplites, 20 heavily armed Greek spearmen. And let's take a look at what you're going to have to combat that. Look at this pathetic turn 1 recruitment. Just look at it, guys. There's nothing of value here. You can get light hoplites, Greek infantry, levy hoplites, this Colchian scout cavalry, which is absolutely nothing special. I mean, 11 armor is alright for an early game skirmish cavalry. Most have like 2 or 4 armor. However, this being a slightly more armored light cavalry but doesn't have great melee stats, but you know, it can cast some javelins here or there. Like, this is not going to help you. This is not going to help you defeat a full army of hoplites, I can tell you that. So here's the play, guys. While Trapezos does have a pretty incredible roster compared to yours, one that you would be hopelessly outmatched against, what they don't have is strategy. These guys, for whatever reason, recruit their army in an incredibly slow way. Just super duper slowly. Seriously, for whatever reason, they just don't recruit any troops for like a couple of turns once the campaign starts. So what I would do is I just blitz them. What you do is you just start recruiting, just abuse your middle class population, basically depopulate them, and just get whatever troops you can. Now you're going to do this for a couple of turns here until you have basically a full stack of these light hoplites who will do reasonably well for you. I mean, these are just generic light hoplites, but generic light hoplites are perfectly satisfactory for early game. And if you get enough of these, they will help you annihilate Trapezos. Outside of that, I would recommend that you recruit a couple of these scout riders too from your middle class population. And then for the rest of your army, I would flesh them out with these Caucasian levies and these Caucasian skirmishers. The levies, because these are actually above average levies since they have 15 armor. So these guys can actually handle themselves in combat and be relatively cheap for what you get. And then these Colchian skirmishers, because they're actually pretty damn good at melee, guys. Like, they're a solid skirmisher with 22 missile damage and 90 range, which is actually above average for an early game skirmisher. But then in melee combat, they have 8 attack, 9 defense, a charge bonus of 26, which is awesome, and then 13 armor penetration. The only weak part about these guys is morale and armor. They only have 1 armor and 36 morale. But outside of that, these guys are idyllic flank troops. These guys will actually annihilate on the flank, beat the vast majority of other skirmishers in melee combat, and be able to kill early game infantry with relative efficiency. So these guys are actually a very useful unit, and you should get lots of them. The other thing that I need to warn you about is that you really should be converting this Hellenic outpost to this Caucasian outpost. Not right away, because this will take 4 turns, and you do need to recruit an army right away. So basically, once you get these guys to like near full stack, or at least once you're done getting your light hoplites and Colchian scout riders sorted out, immediately start converting these guys. And there's one reason for this. This unit. The Georgian Swordsman. An absolute tank of a unit. An absolute beast of a unit. Look at these stats, guys. I know that 9 melee attack and 9 melee defense maybe doesn't put an absolute, you know, excitement throughout your body or whatever not. It doesn't make you that excited. Jeez, what's excitement throughout your body? It doesn't put a tingle in your dingle, right? These guys aren't phenomenal. They're not amazing troops. They're not absurdly great troops, but for early game and relative to what you're going to face on the field, they are genuinely amazing. So objectively, they're not amazing, but in terms of early game rosters that you're going to see within your vicinity, these guys are absurdly good. I mean, 9 melee attack and 9 melee defense is pretty much what you'd see with like an early Thracian style unit. But then you know what else they have? 20 charge bonus. That's really good. That's really good for a swordsman in general, let alone an early game swords unit. 21 weapon damage, excellent. 9 armor penetration, insane. 9 armor penetration is crazy. These guys will help you eliminate hoplites with ease. And then 25 armor. This is the main thing that makes these guys insanely potent in early game. I mean, Thracian infantry only has 8 armor. The vast majority of like Northern European-ish barbarian-style infantry has like 8 to 10 armor. Early game Greek infantry, like the skirmish-style infantry, or the loosely fighting spear infantry. I'm not talking about like pikes or hoplites, but all the looser infantry formations will have nothing close to this much armor. I mean, these guys are tanks in early game, yet their melee stats are actually quite good as well. Once you get these Georgians, you'll actually be able to outclass a lot of factions. And you know who really you do want to outclass and who you do want to take all the territory of? These guys, the Bosphorian Kingdom. The Bosphorian Kingdom have absolutely terrible early game armies. I mean, that's the main challenge of the Bosphorian Kingdom campaign, to be honest. Like, you're rich in early game, but your armies are terrible. So why don't you use this excellent sword unit and just go in here and take everything that they have? Now, your early game army, all you're going to do is just go to Trapezos, and you're going to liberate the city. You're not going to take it, because if you end up in Pontus, you're going to get attacked by everyone. But if you liberate these guys, you have a nice ally to protect your flank, and then you kind of go back for your territory, recruiting Georgian swordsmen, and then go to the Bosphorus and take it. And that's basically the only way I see of surviving early game. I know it's incredibly specific. It's like you're basically on train tracks, and you have almost no freedom in this. But every other mixture of moves that I've tried, from holding this and try to take the Pontus, from maybe taking this territory, try to unite all of the Caucasus, or from going to war against the Armenians and trying to wipe them out. Every single different fusion of things has gotten me absolutely destroyed, absolutely obliterated, and you don't exactly have a ton of money to play around. So if your early game military ventures go wrong, you won't be able to recover again. So that's kind of the play, guys. That's what I've devised, and that's what I recommend for your early game start position. Now let's look at the faction buffs and see if they're helpful to this otherwise pretty helpless faction. Alright, so this is the first colonist faction that I'm doing a guide for, so I just want to introduce them by saying that the colonist factions don't get particularly strong buffs up here. You do get special population technologies, which for basically all these factions, what it means is that you're going to have a barrack for training your Greek-style troops, and another barrack for training whatever barbaric people that are in your territory. For Colchis, it's the Caucasian people, as well as the kind of more Eastern style cavalry that you have. But when it comes to like Massilia, it'll be like Celtic troops. When it comes to Camarria, it'll be steppe troops. When it comes to Syracuse, I actually don't know. I haven't checked that faction out yet, but stay tuned for that. But regardless, when it comes to Colchis, it's going to be those, as well as a couple of very unique temples, which I didn't mention before. But when it comes to Colchis, do build temples. They have some of the strongest, most overpowered temples that I've seen out of any faction. They do absolutely crazy morale boosts or help your units become better. Or, dude, there's just every single temple serves a purpose, and every single temple is extremely powerful. So build your temples and check them out. Colchis has great temples. That's actually the only thing I would say the faction does great. But in any case, these are basically the special buildings, so you basically just lose a buff here. The other one that you have is plus 10 melee defense during battles in own or allied territory. I mean, that's great if you're playing defensive, but let's be honest, in Total War campaigns, you're probably going to be you're going to be fighting in enemy territory the vast majority of the time, so I don't know. This isn't like particularly useful. I'd much rather have plus melee defense when fighting in foreign territory, but I guess they kind of want to show with these colonists they weren't particularly militarily adventurous. They just wanted to build a stable and prosperous home for themselves. So they're going to be strong with the defense and the offense, but this isn't really going to help you a ton. It's just like an okay buff, very, very mid. Now moving on to the culture specific ones, you get increased happiness and presence of other cultures, which is really, really useful. Really, really, really useful. It's going to mean that your public order is very easy to control. In fact, if you just saw, like, early on in the campaign, Colchis, like, the city of half fascists, had insane public order from the very onset. Basically, like, perfect public order without me having to build a single building to help with it. So, in all honesty, assimilation is an absolutely great trait. It just makes your campaign easy, because if you had to also focus on, like, patrolling public order at home, this campaign would be absolutely impossible, so that kind of just means that you can forget about it. Also, increased trade income is good, but keep in mind here, guys, because you're a Caucasian faction, it might be hard to find people willing to trade with you. You're just going to have cultural aversion, a debuff of every single faction diplomatically from, like, turn 1, other than the Cartly. So, increased trade income is useful if you can find people to trade with, but that's the caveat there. Now, the one debuff that you have, and the one that really sucks, is major diplomatic penalty with Greek factions. And this is actually another reason why I really recommend that you attack the Bosphorian Kingdom from the beginning. This is going to ensure that you have horrible diplomatic station with them. Like, the Bosphorian Kingdom will absolutely hate you from the beginning. And in the 3, like, I basically just tested the Colchis out for maybe like 10 turns or so before I made this guide. And in the 3 playthroughs I did with him, the Bosphorian Kingdom declared war on us like turn 2, 2 out of 3 times. Only one of the times was I able to avoid an all-out war of the Bosphorian Kingdom right away. So, because of that, guys, I would just recommend that you go for it yourself, declare war, and take their territory. These guys will inevitably eventually declare war on you. It's just a matter of time. So you might as well strike first. But anyway, those are the buffs, guys. Let's go look at Colchis' roster. Now, this is the roster of Colchis. There really isn't anything particularly special about it, but there is some interesting units here. Like, there are some interesting units. There are some pretty cool units that you can make use of, and interestingly enough, the different cultures that make up this roster play a different role depending on which point in the game you're kind of at. For example, I would say that the Caucasian part of your roster is going to be a lot stronger in early game, but a little bit unimportant in late game. The Greek roster is kind of the inverse of that. They might not be very important in early game, but by late game, you're going to be highly dependent on them. And the eastern part of your roster honestly just remains useful throughout it. But in any case, I'll show you guys what I'm talking about, so it makes a lot more sense. But when it comes to your general, you don't really have any great infantry options. And I'll show you why. These Colchian hoplites, these are just generic hoplites. They are absolutely average hoplites. They're the same as any other regular hoplite in the game. They're not worse than them, but they're not better than them. Hoplites are great, but this one's nothing special. And that's all what this is. If you like a hoplite, use these guys. They are the cheapest general that you're going to have. But they're by far the least powerful, because this is just a perfectly average troop. It's not even elite. Now you do get the Colchian Foot Guards, which is going to be one of your 2 elite hoplite options. It's kind of weird that you get 2 elite hoplite options with Colchis, but this is one of them. And this is a pretty mediocre hoplite, elite hoplite in general. Like, it's so strong, because it is an elite hoplite, but just like the Molossian Guards and just like the Scythian Noble Hoplites, these guys have a little bit less armor than pretty much any other elite hoplite in the game, like a Syracusan elite hoplite, an Athenian elite hoplite, a Rhodesian elite hoplite, an Athenian, whatever faction you guys are talking about, basically, this one's going to have a little bit less armor than them, making them a weaker elite hoplite. But simultaneously, it can still do a lot of damage, because it is an elite hoplite, and no elite hoplite is bad. I said elite hoplite a lot, but I hope you guys get the point. Use it if you want one. If you want an elite hoplite. Otherwise, don't use it. But in all honesty, I would just stick with these guys 101% of the time. It's an extremely powerful unit. It's a melee cavalry that goes in with axes. Doesn't that sound cool? Also, Eastern cavalry has a tradition of using more men in their units than Greek cavalry or Northern European cavalry or really any other type of cavalry besides the Macedonian Sacred Band. So these guys are going to come at you with 90 men per unit, and that's actually a similarity in almost all of Colchis' cavalry. So because you guys have 90, you can kind of look at their stats, and if you look a tiny bit weaker than a typical unit, remember that they have 90 men, in that even though these guys have a little bit lower stats as a whole, they'll be better. But to be honest, this one in particular, this unit in particular, doesn't have worse stats. Like, it has 10 melee attack and 15 melee defense, which is great for a unit available in turn 1. These are absolutely phenomenal melee stats. A charge bonus of 50, which is really good, because this isn't a shock cavalry unit. They have shields. These guys have shields. This is a melee cavalry unit. So 50 is an absolutely great kind of middle ground when it comes to your charge bonus. Now, 27 weapon damage isn't phenomenal, but it's not a restriction either. It's just like a little bit lower than maybe the average elite cavalry unit. But to be completely honest, it's just because of a 90 men. I mean, 5 melee armor penetration damage is great. That's from the axes. Now, going on to the armor, 47 armor is really good, guys. It's really, really good. And 52 morale is also pretty dang solid. It's pretty dang solid, guys. So this is overall an extremely good unit. This is an absolutely elite level unit. Use these guys quite heavily. They will not let you down. It's actually a very heavy cavalry too, so they'll do great on their charge. But even though they're heavy, very heavy, they still have a speed of 6, which is pretty okay. It's pretty alright. Same as like a companion cavalry, which would just be heavy. So overall, excellent unit, and that's really the only part of this roster I would call excellent, their cavalry. Now moving on to their melee infantry. Your melee infantry isn't great, but you do have a bit of an early start with having good infantry in early game. So really just try to abuse your solid early game infantry to get out of your horrible start position. But by late game, we're going to be fighting with pretty mediocre and outdated units, to be honest. But anyway, here's what you have, guys. Start out with your Greek infantry. Absolutely nothing exceptional about these guys. They are typical Greek infantry, low armor, but they skirmish pretty well because they have 3 volleys of javelins. But once you get them into combat, they don't really do a whole lot. These guys pretty much suck. Don't use them. Moving on next, you have the Furrow Swordsmen. I never recommended use Furrow Swordsmen because these guys only have 8 armor, but they essentially are just an upgrade on your Greek infantry. Like, they play the exact same role in combat, they just have a bit more armor and a bit more melee defense and attack to suit, but to suit kind of the later game, because this is something that you get on turn 60, but I never use Furrow Swordsmen, man. I always just find them absolutely lackluster and kind of frustrating. And the worst part about this unit is that it only has 13 charge, so its charge bonus is negligible, which for a sword unit is kind of unacceptable. Moving on to your first good unit, you have the Western Georgian Infantry. This is the first infantry that you unlock when you get the Caucasian barrack, and it's the one that I advise that you use against the Bosphorian Kingdom. These guys are absolute monsters in early game, and keep in mind they'll have an experience chevron when you recruit them. So look at those stats, man. These guys are actually really, really good. Like, if you compare them to, say, an early game Thracian infantry unit, you'll see their raw power and just how amazing they are, guys. Let me just find the Thracians here. Where are the darn Thracians? Here we are. I mean, look at these guys. Only 8 armor. 9, 8, 21, 21. Let's see how these guys compare. Get rid of this. 9, 9, so better melee defense. 20 instead of 21, whatever. 21. And also, these guys have worse armor penetration than my boys, the Western Georgian Infantry. Now, the only negative part about this is that you only have 150 men in this unit compared to the 225 that the Thracian footmen have, but also this is a medium infantry, meaning that they won't be as susceptible to getting destroyed by cavalry, and they'll actually do a little bit better on the charge. It's kind of a hidden bonus that heavier units have. So I'm going to be honest with you guys, these guys will crush virtually any infantry that the Bosphorian Kingdom brings if you utilize these guys well, particularly the melee infantry, which the Bosphorian Kingdom has no good melee infantry options in early game, besides their area of recruitment and mercenary units that they rarely make use of. So if you spam these guys and go to the Bosphorus, you will destroy every single unit that Chimeria brings and just conquer the region. Absolute tank of a unit. You also, with a higher level barrack, get access to the Colchian Corsair Axemen. Absolutely phenomenal unit, but a little bit less steady. A little bit less steady because you have a little bit less armor, but you do get more morale, so I feel like these units are pretty similar on steadiness. Maybe these guys are a little bit better, but also get more melee defense, you get way more charge, your weapon damage goes a little bit down, but your armor penetration goes way up. I mean, in all honesty, these Corsair Axemen are stronger. They are generally stronger. But you do need a higher level barrack to get them, so keep that in mind. But once you get these Corsair Axemen, you might just want to go for an Axe Line and just mainly use these guys. Next unit you're going to have, and again, you just have to keep on upgrading your Caucasian barrack, are these Chilibes Swordsmen. And again, you guys can get these right at the beginning of the game. You don't have to wait for any reforms with these guys. Now the Swordmen, it's okay. It's really not an amazing unit. They're just an upgrade on the Western Georgian Infantry, but they're still a medium melee infantry. They only have 11 attack and 9 defense, which, again, great in early game, but will be extremely outdated later. These guys don't get amazing armor penetration. They just get the customary 7 that like a Thracian-style unit would have. In all honesty, this is not a particularly great unit. It might be cost-effective for the price, because they're not very expensive relative to what you'd usually have to pay for a unit that's like armor penetrating, but also higher up the ladder. But these guys definitely are worse than like late-game Thracians, late-game Dacians, late-game Bactrian units that perform a pretty similar role. And the thing is that because these guys are kind of higher in the barrack chain, you kind of hope that you can use them against more elite units in late game, but they won't hold up either. Like, these guys will be extremely overpowered in early game, because if these guys are overpowered, these guys just have even better stats, but They aren't useful in late game, which makes this unit not a particularly important one. There's just nothing exceptional about these guys. Really, there isn't. Like, 25 armor isn't great. His armor penetration is just okay. 23 weapon damage is, again, it's like high, but it's also whatever. Anyway, moving on. You get these Armazi heavy infantry. They are available right from the onset, but similarly, these guys are not going to hold up in late game. They do an insane amount of armor penetration, but look at their weapon damage. Weapon damage is really low. I mean, I did test these guys out, and look, they are pretty expensive. I did test them out. They do lose against Roman infantry in a one-on-one, and I'm not talking about, like, Imperial legionaries. I'm talking about Marian legionaries. They do lose against them, while costing a bit more to maintain. Once you get to Imperial legionaries, the guys will definitely lose. They do have 35 armor, which is pretty good for an axe unit, but I feel like that weapon damage really screws them over, making them a very average late game axe unit at best. Although you can recruit them pretty early on, but it's going to take you so long to research the technology necessary for building the barrack you need for these guys, but you're basically going to get them in late game anyway. Last but not least, you have the 4x swordsman. I feel like you're just going to use a lot of these in late game. You do need some sort of flexible infantry to protect your flanks, and these guys are going to be by far the most dependable unit that you get in late game. So I imagine you'll probably make use of these guys quite heavily, probably more than these late game Almazi infantry, or Armazi infantry. Although, to be fair, the Armazi do have better stats. I mean, you have less melee attack, but you got more melee defense. You have very similar armor. Honestly, these Armazi aren't that bad, but... And to be fair, being able to go toe-to-toe with a Roman isn't anything to really scoff at. Maybe I am being a little bit too harsh on these guys. You're probably still better than a 4x sword. So you can just mulch through armor. But the weapon damage is really what makes these guys a little bit bad. I mean, honestly, both of these guys, they're not exceptional, but they're not horrible either. That's kind of the take I'll have on these guys. Don't forget, if you run like a Getic assault infantry into a Roman legionary directly, like a Marian legionary, your Getic boys are going to slaughter. We're going to absolutely obliterate those guys. So I just don't think that these guys are like amazing by any means. Now moving on to your spears. You don't really have a lot to talk about here. You have horrible levies. These guys suck. There's really nothing special about them. You don't have javelins. They don't have great stats. These guys are just crappy levies. Cheap, but horrible. These are actually really, really bad levies. Like, way worse than the vast majority of levies that exist in the game. Moving on, you have light hoplites. These are generic light hoplites. They do run really fast, but then their statistics are pretty mild and a little bit disappointing. Primarily that 10 armor really does make them kind of bad. But, you know, they have pretty good melee defense. They have decent weapon damage and charge bonus for a unit that's classified as a hoplite, but ultimately these guys are nothing special. Moving on, you have 4x Spearmen. You unlock them after the 4x reforms. These guys are generic 4x Spearmen. Nothing special. No frills here. They are exceptionally good at holding the line, and they will last forever in combat, but they don't kill much because of low attack. And that's really the main weakness of 4x Spearmen. Again, nothing special here. Just like with, I would argue, a lot of the Caucasian troops that maybe there's something special in early game, but by the time you get to late, they will be outclassed. I'd say the same thing with the Greek components of your infantry corps, but we are getting to the phalanxes now, and in theory, these are what you should be depending on largely as Colchis, although I would say that your Georgian infantry is better in early game, but these phalanxes might be more useful in late game. Now, you do have generic Colchian hoplites. They're generic hoplites. Generic hoplites, they're never exceptionally great, but they're also never exceptionally poor. You can always find a good way to utilize them. You do have pikemen as Colchis, but do listen here. These pikemen are pretty mediocre. I mean, they do have 13 melee attack, which is pretty good for a pikeman. That's actually equivalent to a like elite 4x pike in late game. And you can get these guys right at the beginning of the game. You can get them not turn 1, but you can get them once you have the barrack level for it. These guys, they come out of your Georgian barracks, by the way, not your Greek barracks. But anyway, these guys, their primary weakness is that, of course, they don't have shields. They are pikemen. They only have 25 more armor. I was about to say morale, but 25 armor. That's pretty bad for a pikeman. Most pikemen have 35 armor. The weaker ones have 30. These guys have 25. They can get the weakest when it comes to armor. If you're not fast, only 2 speed, which is normal, but still. Yeah, these guys, they are an offensive pikeman, but the later you, like, these guys will probably do pretty well in early game, particularly against hoplite-bearing factions, but as you get into late game, these guys will be outclassed by the actual pikes of, like, good factions that have pikes. Basically, this unit's gonna be good against factions that have no pikes, but against factions that have pikes, these guys will lose every time. That's the type of unit they are. Moving on, like I mentioned, these Colchis foot guards, they are an elite hoplite, or slightly worse than a lot of other elite hoplites, which is a bit of a problem, but the thing is that you actually have generic Greek elite hoplites, which are absolutely dope. I mean, look, there's some things here that you have to notice. One, this is the heavy phalanx. This elite Greek hoplite is a very heavy phalanx, making him even more stable. Simultaneously, this unit has way better stats. Look at that. Look at that 41 armor. That's really good, guys. You don't get a lot of units with 41 armor in this game. These guys are absolute tanks. Get these guys if you can. They will be useful. Like, I would love a late game Colchis army where my main line is Greek elite hoplites. These guys will actually be able to stand up to quite a lot. But, you know, hoplites, they do have limitations in this game just because of how much pikes destroy them. Like, it doesn't matter how good your hoplite is. If it goes frontally against a pike, it loses. So, because of that, hoplites aren't my favorite units, but if you kind of stick to the far east, it doesn't really matter. You're not going to face a ton of pikes anyway. Now, moving on to your missile infantry, you have a couple of decent options, but you also have a lot of generic crap that you don't really need. Such generic crap starts with the Greek javelin men. Absolutely average javelin men. Don't use these guys. These guys suck unless you're just broke and you want to use something. Next, you have the Colchis hunters. These guys are absolutely nothing special. But here's the one good thing about Caucasian skirmishers and all the things that are called like Colchian. Those things are Caucasian skirmishers. These Colchian hunters, they use axes in melee combat. So these guys are going to get a charge bonus of 24, weapon damage of 16, melee armor penetration of 12 because of the axes, right? Those axes provide high charge bonus as well as high armor penetration. Those are trademark traits of axes. So you know what? The Colchian hunters might be slightly better. Actually, they will be far better in melee than archers that use just knives. However, these archers are pretty much unskilled at melee combat. Like, for weapons are good, but they're unskilled at using them, which is why they have 5 melee attack. And that's why I wouldn't really recommend that you bring them, because you actually have the Colchian skirmishers, which in my opinion are a genuinely really useful and versatile unit. This skirmisher does better skirmishing than the majority of skirmishers, because it does 90 range and 22 missile damage. That's the first plus for this unit. Second thing is that they have 7 melee attack and 7 melee defense, which is the same as Getic Sika skirmishers. So this is actually a pretty competent unit in melee. Now, let's look at those axe buffs I was talking about. 26 charge, amazing charge. Weapon damage 18, not bad for a skirmisher. Not great for a unit, but still competent. And then 13 armor penetration, which is insane. Now, there are limitations to their combat abilities because they have no armor and really low morale. But still, if you can get these guys to hit a flank after throwing all of their high damage missiles, these guys can actually have a battle-changing impact, making them far more useful than the hunters in my opinion. You do have Colchis slingers. These guys are a good slinger because they do 90 range and 11 missile damage. They do have the bad fighting capabilities of this archer, so don't really use them for that, but they are going to be pretty good at killing your opponents at range, so if you do like slingers, take a look at these guys and use them. You have generic Greek peltas. I don't really want to go over these because I've covered them so many times. Generic Greek peltas are good units. Simple as that. They are very good units. They do come from your second population class, so if you want to use your second population class to get a skirmish unit, then use these guys. Some people are just kind of averse to that, but these Greek peltas have phenomenal combat stats and can basically compete in your main line in early game, which is a pretty useful thing, but also in the context of this faction, I wouldn't really want to devote a ton of money towards these missile units because you're kind of broke, honestly. You're a pretty poor faction. So I would just use these Colchian skirmishers because they're more cost effective than these Greeks and they're easier to recruit. Now, with your higher tier barrack, specifically for your Caucasian troops, you're going to get these Svan warriors. And these guys are actually really, really good. 175 range, 16 missile damage, paints them as clearly an elite archer. They also have 7 melee attack and 14 melee defense, giving them the melee stats of one of the better levy style units. But they give you 22 weapon damage and 18 charge, 20 armor. They're just, in general, kind of a pretty stable unit when it comes to fighting, as well as giving you an elite archer stat. They're just solid. To be fair, these aren't like game-changing elite archers, but they're like a solid elite archer. But the melee capabilities that I mentioned are genuinely not like amazing, and their charge bonus is pretty low, and they don't do much armor penetrating, which is the negative of these guys. To be completely honest, like out of all of these units, my favorite by far is the Colchis skirmishers. I think that this is by far the best bang for buck you're going to get out of your skirmish line. But there's an elite archer if you do want to basically make like as elite of an army as you can. And while these guys are better bang for buck, these guys are just like objectively better. Now moving on to your shock cavalry, this is where a lot of your factional quality lies. This shock cavalry is just unit by unit really good, with the exception of these heavy lancers who are not very good. Don't use these guys, but all the other units are really good. Start out with these guys, right? This is kind of like your cheapest cavalry unit, and they are genuinely really cheap, really cost effective for a cavalry unit. They don't have the best stats. 47 charge isn't great. 26 weapon damage is good, but they don't have the armor penetration or anything like that to really make up with it, and they have a measly 28 armor. But what this unit basically is like an Eastern, like a Caucasian / Armenian version of a citizen cavalry. And these guys will absolutely obliterate Greek citizen cavalry. Like, you run these guys into Greek citizen cavalry or Greek Tarentine cavalry or anything that's equivalent, these guys will do really well. So don't see them as like a super powerful cavalry, but see them as a decent cost-effective cavalry that'll hit. They'll basically do better than they should, but they aren't amazing. Now moving on, like I said, you have heavy lancers. This is the only Greek cultured cavalry that you have in the shock cavalry category, and they suck. They're like the bad version of companion cavalry. They have 38 armor, which is weaker than the majority of like companion-style cavalry. They have 52 base morale, which is lower morale than the majority. Most good ones have a melee attack of 15. These guys have 13. Most good ones have a charge bonus of 60. These guys have 57. Now, if you just have a really good Hellenic barrack, but like no good Caucasian barrack in a settlement, I can see why you'd recruit these guys out of necessity. But if you can avoid it, just don't use them, because this unit's going to be so much better. The Cartevelian Cataphracts. These guys are just absolutely amazing. Firstly, they're very heavy shock cavalry, so this mass will help out with the charge. Secondly, they have a charge of 62, which is an insane number. Sure, for melee attack and defense is not great, but remember, these guys have 90 men. So you expect them to have slightly worse stats, but be able to do better in combat. 19 weapon damage isn't great, but that's because these guys pull out axes and do 12 armor penetration, which is way higher than normal. 47 armor is also pretty damn good. And again, these guys have more men, so these guys are insane. I tested them out, and believe me, these guys absolutely slap, man. These guys are insane. They do well against other cavalry, but far better for hammer and anvils. These guys are the masters of hammer and anvils. Use them for that. For counter cavalry stuff, stick with your Colchian bodyguard cavalry. Stick with these guys. Again, it's a Caucasian style troop, but these guys are an insane unit. This is a slept on unit. So if you really do compare these guys, like the Colchian bodyguards, they have the same mass, and it's like they just have way better combat stats, like 19 weapon damage versus 27. Think about that. It's way higher. And of course, these Colchian bodyguards have cataphract level armor, which is a really positive thing. And more morale. So that's like the main thing. I would mainly just stick with the Colchian bodyguard, plus 50 charge is nothing to scoff at. This will do it for a hammer and anvil. You don't need 62, but 62 is a luxury. Either way, to be honest with you, these two are just exceptionally good. Use this Colchian bodyguard as basically your like elite melee cavalry, and use these cataphracts as just like an insane hammer and anvil specialist. Use them like elephants. For missile cavalry, there isn't a ton to talk about. You have your generic barbaric missile cavalry with your Colchian, or rather these Cartevelian light horse skirmishers. Nothing exceptional about these guys. They're generic skirmishers, they have low armor. These guys are good armor penetration damage, but for melee stats are pretty bad. As like all light skirmish cavalry, you know, do. Like, they're just not going to be particularly good. To be fair, because, like, your early barracks, either the Greek ones or the Caucasian ones, are going to have these missile cavalry as your options, you're going to have some in your early army. I actually prefer the Greek one here, the Colchian scout cavalry, because these guys have 11 armor, which is actually pretty good for an early game skirmish cavalry. And the Greek one also, they use axes, so they do the same armor penetration and charge and everything. They have slightly worse melee stats, but both of them are horrible at melee. So I don't really think that really matters. So I would stick with the Colchian scout cavalry. But honestly, neither of these is really good. Like, once you can get your shock cavalry, just dip out of using these. These are horrible. But you do have these Colchian medium cavalry too, which you eventually get with a higher level barrack. I forget if it's a Greek or... I think that this one is from the Greek one, to be honest. That's the vibe I'm getting. I did forget to check, but I'm pretty sure we're from the Greek one. Regardless, you can check it out for yourself if you're doing a Colchis campaign. What I can't say is that I approve of this unit. It's insanely good. It's insanely good considering that you get your 90 men, you have 22 missile damage at 90 range, which is absolutely great for a horse skirmisher. They shoot really quick. But then also, they just have exceptionally good melee capabilities, so 12 armor penetration, 10 melee attack, 6 melee defense, and okay-ish 28 armor, and 8 speed despite being a medium cavalry. That's the thing, guys. 8 speed despite being a medium cavalry. This unit is just incredibly solid. Like, I know that the stats that I had mentioned, like, nothing here is, like, exceptionally strong about this unit, but they're just, like, so solid in every regard. Like, they're pretty good at skirmishing. They're pretty good at melee. They can do a hammer and anvil with 40 charge bonus, and because they're medium weight, they'll actually have an impact with it. And they do armor penetration too, so they can stay in a combat and actually fight cavalry pretty well. These guys, they won't dominate in any regard other than as horse skirmishers. These guys are very competent with their javelins. But in every other regard, they can just do it. So these guys are like the jack of all trades for a pretty decent price tag too. Which makes them a solid unit, although not a super duper interesting unit. And that's really the theme that you have here, guys. Like, you have some solid units. Like, you have solid early game swordsmen and your Georgians. You have solid late game infantry and your 4-axe swords and your 4-axe spears, as well as these Armazi heavy infantry that maybe was a little bit too hard on. So, you know, they could still go toe-to-toe with a Roman legionary, given the right circumstances, of course. These guys are much worse at resisting missiles than Roman legionaries. And of course, you have elite phalanxes, which can also be good, as well as a pike option. You do have one extremely cost-effective infantry unit, as well as the option for elite archers if you want them. But at the end of the day, it's just like, this roster is not super-duper tight in any way. Like, if you want to have better melee infantry here, you can use the Kartli. If you want to have better cavalry, you can use the Armenians, which will have a lot of the same cavalry options, as well as a lot of the same infantry options. If you want better phalanxes, almost any Greek faction will have better phalanxes. And, of course, if you do want better missile infantry, there's a lot of options. It's not a particularly solid missile infantry selection here. When it comes to your shock cavalry, or really your cavalry in general, like the Seleucids would have better options, the Parthians would have better options, like any Eastern style faction would have pretty much better or similar options. So, it just, when you combine all of them, you can just go somewhere else for better versions of that. And because of this, I would give this faction, in terms of how much you need to play this campaign, how much I recommend you play this campaign, like whether I'm excited about it, as really a 1 out of 10. There's nothing super special about these guys. They are, unfortunately, a little bit mediocre. There really isn't anything to say about it other than that. I'd much more recommend that you just play like an Armenian campaign or something with these guys. But what I can say is that if you're a person that wants a really, really hard campaign, like, you just want to challenge yourself here and just kind of struggle through some of the worst situations that Divinity Impera can play and really kind of take ragged people and get them to riches. This campaign's for you. That's what this is for. This is just a challenge, man. This is a Mr. Beast challenge. That's what this is all about here. Now, in terms of difficulty, I would rate this a solid 10 out of 10, to be completely honest with you. And it's just because, like, maybe I didn't sell it enough when I was just doing, you know, the campaign map stuff, but truthfully, these guys, they will get declared war on by everyone. And you just don't have the resources to properly fight these wars. That's why you have to be extremely tight about your early maneuvers and just wipe out Trapezos and just go for the Bosphorus Kingdom and slaughter them. So in terms of difficulty, definitely a 10 out of 10. And in late game, you're going to struggle with like a main line of elite hoplites or 4-axe swords or Armazi infantry. It's just going to be a little bit hard. Your cavalry is going to be the main redeeming factor. Nothing about your skirmishers is really going to help you in late game. You just have some cost-effective Colchian skirmishers, but by late game, these guys are going to be not very useful. In fact, I feel like I'm excited about their use in early game, but not really late game. They're going to be just a little outclassed in late game by almost every skirmisher. So there you have it, guys. Not an insanely powerful faction. Oh, in terms of power, I guess that's also another ranking I tend to do. Like, how powerful are these guys relative to other factions? I would give them a 3 out of 10. I mean, they do have some solid options. Like, this Colchian bodyguard cavalry is genuinely really good. And they have, elite hoplites as an option, melee infantry and whatnot. They do have tools. Like, they can kill. It's just, they have worse tools than the vast majority of factions. So, 3 out of 10. They're not the worst faction. Somewhere between 3 leaning to 2.5, I would say. They can get it done, but they're just hard. And the start position's really hard. So once again, one of the hardest factions in the game. I wouldn't say for number 1 hard. I feel like maybe the Syracusans have a slightly worse start position. I mean, not even slightly. They're caught between Carthage and Rome. They have a harder start position. But maybe a better roster. We'll have to check it out. But still, it's between them and Syracuse for hardest faction in the game for sure. Unless I'm just missing some barbarian faction that's insanely difficult, it's gonna be one of those two. So there we have it, boys. Extremely hard faction. Try them out if you want a challenge, and yeah, see you in the next guide.